Welcome back to the channel, gentle souls. Tonight, we drift into the dark together. Pull the blankets close, ensure your doors are locked, and let the rain outside wash away the waking world. These stories are true, lingering echoes of the real horrors that walk among us. Sleep well, if you can. Story 1. The Room of Molded Plastic. I have been a journeyman electrician for several years now. At 5'2" and barely holding on to 120 pounds, I am profoundly aware of my vulnerabilities in this world. My time in the military gave me some grounding in self-defense, and my subsequent years as a big city paramedic hardened my nerves against blood and panic. I always carry my license protection, and I rarely rattle easily. But nothing prepares you for the cold, sinking instinct of pure human malice. It was a damp Friday evening, around 7:30 p.m., when the dispatch radio hummed to life. An older, low-income apartment complex a few towns over had reported a partial blackout in one of its units. The moment my truck pulled into the cracked asphalt lot, an overwhelming sense of dread settled in my chest. The building looked decaying, almost abandoned. I paused in the driver's seat, pulled out my phone, and sent a pin drop of my exact coordinates to my office supervisor, my boyfriend, and my mother. My text was explicit. This is where I am. The client's name is Arthur Vance, Unit 4B. If you don't hear from me every 20 minutes, try calling. If I don't answer, send the authorities immediately. I stepped out into the heavy night air and pressed the rusted buzzer for Unit 4B. A voice like grinding gravel cut through the intercom, a heavy, rattling cough of a man who smoked far too much. He barked a demand to know who it was. I kept my tone clipped, professional, and stated my business. The buzzer clicked, releasing the heavy security door. The interior staircase smelled of old decay, wet ashtrays, unwashed skin, and cheap, sour alcohol. When Arthur Vance opened the door to his apartment, the stench nearly drove me back down the stairs. He was tall, gaunt and skeletal, with hollowed-out cheeks covered in a patchy, uneven stubble. His eyes were surrounded by heavy, dark bruising, sunken deep into his skull. He wore stained, oversized clothes that looked as though they had absorbed years of bodily fluids and spilled meals. As I crossed the threshold, my steel-toed boot struck something heavy on the linoleum. A plastic whiskey jug skidded across the floor. The power's failing in the back, he muttered, trailing off as he turned away from me. I asked for the specific symptoms of the outage, but his answers were erratic and fragmented. He led me deeper into the flat, toward the master bedroom, where the breaker panel was located. Every step felt like a gauntlet. We passed the kitchen, where the sink overflowed with rotting dishes, stacked precariously like a sickening game of architectural balance. The carpets beneath my feet were littered with black burn marks, the unmistakable signs of someone dropping lit cigarettes while nodding off into a stupor. Then we entered the bedroom. In the center of the room sat a bare mattress. No sheets, no pillows, just a stained, tattered gray blanket. The furniture around it was broken, waterlogged, looking as though it had been dragged from a curb on a rainy night. But it was what lay on the bed that made my blood turn to ice. Resting on the bare mattress was the pristine, pale torso of a female store mannequin. It looked as though it had been torn from a defunct storefront. As I maneuvered around the bed to reach the electrical panel, my foot caught on something heavy beneath the tattered blanket. I looked down. Peeking out from the fabric were the severed legs of the mannequin. They hadn't been neatly disassembled. They had been brutally hacked apart at the joints with a dull hacksaw, leaving jagged, white plastic teeth along the faux flesh. Right next to those severed plastic limbs, a small, rhythmic light caught my eye. A dull crimson light was pulsing steadily against the man's ankle. It was a Department of Corrections GPS tracking monitor. My breath hitched. I had to turn my back to this man to open the metal breaker panel. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, but panic would only invite aggression. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled my tools, tracing the wires, acutely aware of the heavy silence behind me. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the rustle of his clothes as he slipped into the living room every few minutes to take a heavy, guttural swig from a brown paper bag. I did the bare minimum. I rigged a safe, temporary bypass to restore a single circuit, closed the panel, and told him in a level voice that I would need to order parts and return the following Monday. I took his signature, refused cash, and walked toward the exit. He didn't stay in the room. He followed me. He stalked a mere 2 feet behind me down the hallway, down the concrete stairs, and out into the cool night air. I didn't walk to my truck. I marched, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and threw the locks. As I twisted the key in the ignition, I glanced up at my rearview mirror. Arthur Vance wasn't standing on the porch. He had moved into the shadows by the rear quarter panel of my utility truck. He was just standing there in the dark, his hollow eyes fixed completely on my mirror, staring directly into my soul. No expression, no movement, just watching. I jammed the truck into drive and tore out of the parking lot, driving blindly for 3 blocks before slamming on the brakes in a well-lit gas station. The adrenaline crash hit me like a physical blow. I sat there shaking, sobbing silently, reassuring my frantic family over the phone that I was breathing. When I spoke to my supervisor, he casually mentioned sending me back with a male apprentice on Monday. The sheer terror that suggestion induced drove me to open my phone and search the public court records for Arthur Vance. The truth was worse than any nightmare. He had been released from a state penitentiary less than 48 hours prior. He had served a sentence for aggravated stalking. When his female victim had threatened to notify the police, Vance had shattered her back window, entered her home with a blade, and commanded her to strip. When she screamed, he explicitly detailed how he was going to end her life and dismember her piece by piece. The mannequin on his bed wasn't a strange quirk. It was his blueprint. His fantasy was perfectly intact, waiting for the next door to open. My company blacklisted the address, and I never went back. But whenever I work late in an unfamiliar house and the shadows stretch across an empty hallway, I still see those jagged, hacked plastic legs hiding under the bed. Story 2. The Holes in the Iron Door. This memory takes me back to the vibrant but deceptive spring of 2016, during my sophomore year of high school. My name is Ethan. At 16, I had just earned the privilege of walking home from school instead of riding the crowded buses. It was a modest 25-minute journey through our suburban Michigan town, a routine I looked forward to as a rare pocket of solitude. On this particular afternoon, the final bell rang, and the sky was a brilliant, crisp blue. Feeling adventurous, I opted to eschew my standard neighborhood route and take the industrial bypass, an isolated stretch of road flanked by the high school baseball diamond on one side and a sprawling, mostly abandoned manufacturing strip on the other. I had both of my headphones shoved deep into my ears, the music turned up to a deafening volume to block out the world. I was lost in the canopy of new leaves, drifting along the gravel path that ran between the rusted corrugated structures. As I walked, I passed a building that sat completely apart from the active warehouses. It was small, windowless, and constructed of heavy, decaying cinder blocks. The facade was strangely scarred, covered in deep pockmarks and jagged grooves, as though someone had spent months furiously striking the exterior with a chisel or a heavy iron bar. I paid it little mind, stepping past it into a blind spot between two larger structures. It was during the brief, silent space between the ending of one song and the beginning of another that the sound cut through. It was a scream, but not a scream of surprise or anger. It was a high-pitched, ragged tear of absolute human agony. I froze, ripping the headphones down to my neck. The silence of the industrial yard rushed in, heavy and suffocating. For a second, I tried to convince myself it was a vocal sample from the upcoming track on my playlist. Then, a second scream shattered the air. It was closer this time, echoing violently off the concrete walls. If you ever find yourself in a place like that, and you hear a sound like that, you run. You don't look. You don't investigate. You run until you find people, and you call for help. But at 16, fueled by a reckless, stupid curiosity, I stepped back toward the scarred building. The heavy iron door at the front was ancient, eaten away by decades of orange rust. Near the center, the corrosion had entirely consumed the metal, creating a jagged, irregular peephole, roughly the size of a silver dollar. I swallowed the lump in my throat, leaned forward, and pressed my eye to the rusted opening. The interior was dimly lit by a single, flickering fluorescent tube hanging from an exposed rafter. In the center of the damp concrete floor was a woman. She was on her knees, her clothes torn, stained with fresh blooming patches of crimson. Her face was a mask of swelling and dark bruises. Standing over her was a tall man clad entirely in heavy black canvas. Over his head, he wore a cheap, distorted plastic theatrical mask, the kind you see hanging in budget party stores, featuring a frozen, grotesque caricature of a smiling face. In his gloved right hand, he held a standard framing hammer. The claw and the heavy, blunt head were glistening with a thick, dark fluid. I watched him raise his arm. I cannot and will not describe the specific brutality that followed. The sheer, visceral reality of the violence struck me like a physical blow to the stomach. My body revolted. I stumbled backward from the iron door, falling to my knees in the dirt, dry heaving violently. I hadn't eaten lunch that day, so nothing came up but bitter bile. The sound of my retching must have echoed through the thin metal of the structure. Within seconds, the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots began to accelerate across the interior concrete. They were coming directly for the door. Panic paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. As I scrambled to my feet, my hand instinctively dove into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone, just as the heavy iron door creaked open, exposing the towering figure in the plastic smile. I held the phone up, high, right at his face. "I'm recording you," I screamed, my voice cracking with a terrifying mixture of bluff and pure terror. "It's streaming live. If you touch me, everyone sees your face." We stood there in the dead space between the buildings. Total silence. He didn't speak. He didn't breathe loudly. He just stared at me through the narrow eye slits of that horrific smiling plastic mold. The hammer hung at his side, dripping slowly into the weeds. Then, with a sudden, violent jerk, he pulled the iron door shut. The heavy latch clicked into place from the inside. I didn't wait. I turned and ran faster than I ever thought my legs could carry me, my feet tearing through the gravel as I dialed 911 with trembling fingers. I sobbed my story to the dispatcher, refusing to stop running until I reached the busy intersection of a main highway half a mile away. Within 7 minutes, 2 police cruisers screamed past me, heading into the industrial park. I waited by the roadside, my heart hammering against my ribs. When the officers returned to interview me, their faces were grim. They had breached the building. They found the single fluorescent light, a pooling collection of blood on the floor, and several strands of torn hair. But the room was empty. In the few minutes it took for me to run and call for help, the man in the mask had vanished, dragging the injured woman out through a rear loading bay into an unseen vehicle. The police never caught him. I spent weeks scouring the local news, checking missing persons reports, searching for any mention of a woman taken from our town. Nothing ever surfaced. It was as if they had both been swallowed whole by the earth. I never walked home again. I transferred to an alternative school across the county before the winter arrived, desperate to put miles between myself and that rusted iron door. I am 21 now, but every time I hear the dull, heavy strike of a hammer against wood, my stomach turns, and I am back in the dirt, looking through the rust. Story 3. The Screen Door Latch. In the late summer of 2011, I returned to civilian life after an honorable discharge from the Navy. The economic fallout of the 2008 crash was still suffocating the job market, forcing me to move back in with my parents in Michigan while I tried to secure a stable career. My mother loved having me around. The historic family farmhouse had tragically burned down a year prior, and they were stuck renting a small, drafty property on the outskirts of a rapidly declining neighborhood. The house was poorly maintained, tucked away on a street, with a reputation for midnight sirens, and crucially, it possessed no front porch light. The entrance was always shrouded in total, pitch-black shadow once the sun went down. We saw a lot of misery on that street. There was a suspected brothel down the block that saw frequent tactical police raids. An arsonist took down a vacant house 3 doors over. The local parish was burglarized twice, and the man directly across the street was taken away in handcuffs on a near weekly basis for domestic disturbances. But none of those neighborhood terrors compared to what happened on our own front porch. It was a sweltering evening in early September. My parents had gone out to a dinner function, leaving me alone in the house. Because the property lacked air conditioning, the air inside was thick and suffocating. To catch the faint evening breeze, I left the heavy wooden front door wide open, relying solely on the locked screen door to keep the bugs out. I was in my bedroom, sitting at my desk, talking to my fiancée over a Skype video call. She was living in Ireland at the time, and the sound of her voice was a comforting escape from the humid room. From my desk, I had a direct, unobstructed line of sight down the short hallway to the front screen door. Around 10 p.m., a faint, distinct sound cut through my fiancée's voice over the speakers. Click, clack. It was the unmistakable metallic rattle of the outer thumb latch on the screen door. I paused, squinting down the dark hallway. The porch was a wall of blackness. I watched for a moment, assuming a stray gust of wind had caught the frame or a nocturnal animal had brushed against the mesh. But the leaves on the maple trees outside were completely still. There wasn't a breath of wind. I went back to my conversation. 2 minutes passed. Click, click, clack. The sound was deliberate this time. Someone was pressing the metal lever down, lifting it and letting it snap back into place. "Hold on a second," I whispered to my fiancée. I stood up, stepping quietly across the linoleum floor. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter, but kept it switched off. As my foot reached the threshold of the front hallway, the latch jiggled a third time, this time with a violent, impatient jerk, as if someone was trying to force the small internal lock to snap. I stepped into the open doorway and slammed my hand against the wooden frame. Through the dark mesh of the screen, a shadow detached itself from our house. A man stepped backward off the low porch, his boots crunching quietly in the dry grass. He was wearing a dark, hooded sweatshirt, despite the stifling heat. "Can I help you with something?" I demanded, my military posture locking into place, my voice booming into the yard. The man didn't startle. He didn't turn around. He simply kept his back to me and began walking at a slow, casual pace across our gravel driveway, cutting diagonally toward the overgrown hedge that separated our lot from the neighbors. Just as he reached the property line, my parents' headlights swept into the driveway. The high beams illuminated the figure perfectly as he slipped through a gap in the neighbor's fence and vanished toward their rear door. My father climbed out of the car, his brow furrowed as he looked from the dark fence line back to me, standing in the open doorway. "Marcus, what's going on? Who was that?" I explained the rhythmic rattling of the latch, the deliberate attempts to open the door, and the man's total lack of urgency when caught. My father's expression hardened. He walked over to his porch chair, checking a near full pack of cigarettes he had left on the side table. They were untouched. Determined to get answers, my dad walked across the lawn to the neighbor's house. It took several minutes of heavy knocking before the front door finally creaked open. The man who answered fit the description perfectly. When my dad asked why he was on our dark porch, manipulating our door latch, the man gave a hollow, unconvincing excuse. Just looking to borrow a smoke, man. Then why didn't you knock? My dad pressed. And why did you run when my son called out to you? The neighbor didn't answer. He just stared blankly for a moment, then backed into the darkness of his house and slammed the door. The next morning, my dad spoke with the landlords of that property, an elderly, pleasant couple who lived a few streets over. When we described the encounter, the old woman's face fell. She confessed that the man living in the back room was their adult son. He had been released from prison just 3 weeks prior after serving a multi-year sentence for violent home invasions and burglary. 6 weeks later, the flashing red and blue lights of the county sheriff illuminated our street once more. The neighbor's son had been caught red-handed inside another home 2 blocks away, having crept through an unlocked kitchen window while a young family slept upstairs. He was sent back to the state penitentiary for parole violation. We bought our own home in a quiet, rural county shortly after that. But to this day, whenever I am staying in an old house and the night grows quiet, I find myself staring down the hallway, waiting for the sound of a loose metal latch to click in the dark. Story 4. The Shadows of the Primary Oval. This final account happened back in the late autumn of 2020. I was 14 at the time, and my younger sister Lily was 13. To give you context, Lily was an incredibly anxious child, prone to dramatic overreactions that often turned minor inconveniences into full-blown panics. Because of this, I had developed a bad habit of tuning her out. It was a mistake that almost cost us everything. It was right around 6 p.m. on a cool evening. Our mother had gone out to a dinner event across town and wasn't expected back until midnight. Our older brother was staying at our father's apartment, leaving just me, Lily, and our 10-year-old brother, Leo, alone in the house. To burn off some energy, Lily and I decided to take our border collie for a rundown at the local primary school. The school grounds were expansive, designed in a classic suburban layout, and sprawling cluster of detached single-story brick classrooms, separated by covered walkways, leading out onto 2 massive, open grass ovals. We walked through the shadows of the empty corridors to reach the far oval, unclipping the dog's lead so he could sprint across the turf. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, bruised shade of purple. We had been there for about 15 minutes when Lily suddenly gasped, her fingers digging violently into the fabric of my jacket. "Chloe, look, I think someone is watching us from the building." I looked over, scanning the dark glass windows of the nearest classroom block. It's probably just the night janitor, Lily. Calm down. If they ask what we're doing, we'll just tell them we're walking the dog. Lily's eyes remained wide, darting frantically across the shadows between the brick pillars. I sighed, pulling out my phone and ignoring her, assuming it was just another instance of her hyper-reactive imagination. By 6:30 p.m., the darkness had truly settled. The temperature was dropping fast. "Let's head back," I said, whistling for the dog. When the dog didn't return immediately, I looked out onto the oval. He was standing perfectly rigid, 50 yards away, his ears pinned flat against his skull, his low growl vibrating through the quiet air. He wasn't looking at us. He was staring intently at the concrete sports equipment shed directly behind where Lily and I were standing. I turned around, an annoyed grimace on my face. "Come on, boy, let's go," I called out, snapping the lead back onto his collar. That's when Lily grabbed my arm again. This time, her hand was trembling so violently, I could feel it through my sleeve. Her voice was a terrified, breathless whisper. "Chloe, do not look right now, but there is a man crouching behind the edge of the brick wall. He's looking right at us." A cold spike of adrenaline hit my chest. I didn't want to look. I was terrified that if he saw me notice him, he would move. "Walk. Normal," I muttered through clenched teeth. We began to walk at a brisk pace toward the main exit gate, our dog pulling hard against the leash, his head locked back toward the dark buildings. The moment our feet cleared the school boundary and hit the public sidewalk, we broke into a frantic, terrifying sprint. We ran the entire 2 blocks home, our hearts hammering, practically fracturing the front door handle in our desperation to get inside. We slammed the door, throwing the deadbolt, and collapsed onto the entryway floor, panting for air. "Did you actually see someone?" I gasped, trying to find my breath. "Yes," Lily sobbed. "He was wearing a dark coat, crouching down in the dirt, watching us through the gaps in the railings." A deep, primal instinct flared up in my gut. I stood up and ran through the house, throwing the heavy locks on every window, sliding the security bolts on the back sliding door, and pulling the heavy blackout curtains shut across every pane of glass so no one could peer inside. I walked back into the living room, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. Look, maybe it was just a teacher staying late to grade papers. Knock, knock, knock. The sound on our front door was heavy, solid, and terrifyingly close. Lily and I froze, our mouths hanging open in sheer shock. It couldn't be our mother. She had her own keys, and it was barely 7 p.m. Even if she had forgotten her keys, she would have called out our names. It wasn't our older brother either. We lived on a quiet cul-de-sac, and we absolutely would have heard a car door slam in the driveway. Knock, knock, knock. Then a voice cut through the thick wood of the door. It was a raspy, husky whisper, like someone whose vocal cords had been deeply damaged or strained. "Hello? Open up. I have mail for you." My stomach bottomed out. Before I could say a word, our 10-year-old brother, Leo, wandered out of his bedroom down the hall. "Who's at the door?" he asked loudly. Lily and I cringed, terror paralyzing us. The stranger on the porch definitely heard him. The raspy voice returned immediately, louder this time, accompanied by a frantic rattling of the doorknob. "Yeah, open the door. The kid is home. Open up. I have something for you." Leo looked at us, confusion turning to fear as he saw the absolute horror on our faces. I shook my head wildly, dropping to my knees and motioning for him to get down. "Crawl," I mouthed. The three of us crawled on our hands and knees across the carpet, hiding ourselves in the dark corner of the kitchen beneath the breakfast bar. Leo began to cry silently, the confusion overpowering him. Suddenly, a violent, metallic scraping sound echoed from the rear of the house. Jiggle, jiggle, jiggle. Someone was at the back glass sliding door, aggressively throwing their weight against the handle, trying to force the track open. Our town was incredibly safe. We never experienced crime like this. It felt like a movie, a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. I reached into my pocket for my phone to call the authorities, but my pocket was empty. My heart stopped. I had left it on the coffee table in the center of the living room. To get to it, I would have to crawl directly past the hallway that faced the back glass door. "Do you have your phone?" I whispered to Lily. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It's on the dock by the television." Breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, I pulled myself along the kitchen tile, peeking my head cautiously around the drywall corner to look down the back hallway. Through the clear glass at the top of the back door, I saw him. The lighting from the neighbor's yard illuminated his features with terrifying clarity. His hair was long, matted with grease, and hung in wild strands around his shoulders. His skin was a sickening jaundiced yellow, and his eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely manic. The moment his gaze shifted down and met mine, his face contorted into a horrific grin. He began to violently slam his fists against the double-paned glass, screaming a loud, unintelligible stream of pure gibberish. I screamed, abandoning all caution. I scrambled to my feet, sprinted into the living room, snatched my phone from the coffee table, and dialed the emergency services. I bellowed our address to the operator over the sound of the manic screeching outside. Then came a sound that will stay with me until the day I die. Crack! It was the heavy wooden frame of the back door splintering under a massive physical impact. He was ramming his shoulder into the wood, and the frame was caving inward, moving faster than I ever thought possible. I threw my phone into my pocket, grabbed Leo by the collar, yanked Lily by the arm, and dragged them into the small hallway bathroom. I slammed the heavy bathroom door, threw the small privacy lock, and forced my siblings into the empty bathtub, covering them with my own body. Only then did I realize my fatal mistake. I hadn't grabbed a single weapon, no knife, no heavy object. We were trapped in a dead-end room with a hollow core door. A second later, a loud, explosive crash echoed through the house. The back door had given way entirely. We heard his heavy, dragging footsteps echo onto the linoleum. He was inside our home. He was still screaming that horrible guttural gibberish, running frantically from room to room, throwing open closet doors, slamming walls, searching for where the children had gone. For 2 agonizing minutes, we lay in that bathtub, pressing our hands over Leo's mouth to muffle his trembling sobs. The heavy footsteps turned down our hallway, stopping directly outside the bathroom door. The brass knob began to twist. Then, the air was cut by the beautiful, screaming wail of police sirens tearing down our street. The footsteps outside the door froze. A second later, we heard the heavy thud of the intruder sprinting back through the shattered kitchen door, fleeing into the night. From the front windows, the loud, commanding shouts of police officers echoed through the neighborhood. "Get on the ground. Do it now." The bathroom door was eventually opened by a calm female police officer who guided us out into the living room. I remember collapsing against her uniform, sobbing uncontrollably. The police apprehended the man in our backyard. He was a severely disturbed individual with a history of violent delusions who had escaped a nearby psychiatric facility earlier that afternoon. I often look back on that warm autumn evening at the primary school oval. I think about what would have happened if we had stayed just 5 minutes longer, or if I had ignored Lily's warnings entirely. The camping spot and the truck. This happened in Georgia, told by a man named Eric. He was a teenager with 3 friends, Doug, Lewis, and Isaiah, spending a few days camping at a lake that Doug had found on a previous trip. Spring break, a camping spot Doug called exceptional. Eric was the only one with a license, so he drove. The route to the lake took them down a 2-lane highway, through a turn at an intersection, and down a narrowing road that became dirt and dark fast, the trees pressing in from both sides, thick enough to block most of the available afternoon light. They passed a handful of houses on the way in, old places. What caught their collective attention, though they didn't discuss it much at the time, was that nearly every one of them had a chimney with smoke coming from it. It was the beginning of spring. It wasn't cold. The campsite was a small clearing with a circle road and a grass patch in the center, and the lake nearby through a gap in the trees. They set up, split into pairs. Eric and Doug went to collect firewood deeper in the woods opposite the lake, while Lewis and Isaiah built a fire pit with rocks. In the woods, deep in the tall grass, Doug spotted a truck. Old, rusted, green Ford from the early 1990s, based on the body style. A raised bed cover on the back with windows on the sides, the glass cracked. It had been sitting there long enough for the grass to grow up around the tires, long enough to look like it had always been there. They noted it and went back to camp. Night came. Fire was built. Beers were opened. They told bad stories and made each other laugh, and the darkness around them was the good kind of darkness that a fire makes. Warm inside the circle, complete outside it. Eric had drunk enough that his body decided it was time to make its way to the edge of the trees to be sick. He went alone. He finished what he went there for. He turned back toward the distant point of the fire. The truck was there. He almost walked into it. His phone light revealed it in sections. The cracked glass of the windows, the rust pattern, newspapers, On the floor of the cab, some crushed cans, and something else on the floorboards that his light lingered on without him wanting to acknowledge it. Needles. He moved the light up to the back of the truck, to the window of the bed cover. The face on the other side of the glass was looking directly at him. It was not a normal face. The eyes had no visible pupils, white throughout, or pale enough to read as white in the phone light. The mouth was stretched in a smile that was too wide and too fixed, the smile of a person for whom smiling had become something involuntary, something that had stopped being an expression and become a condition. His face was cross-hatched with old scars. His arms, when he lifted them to bang on the glass, were bleeding from what looked like recent cuts, and his shirt was in ribbons. He looked at Eric and said through the glass, with perfect certainty and an intimacy that made no sense given the circumstance, "I knew you'd come. It's you. It's finally you." Eric screamed. He ran back toward the fire, screaming. Behind him, he heard the truck door open. He ran hard and hit the edge of the campfire ring and went down face first in the gravel, scattering embers. When he got up, he turned. The headlights of the truck were on. The engine was running. It had been sitting dead in those weeds for what looked like a decade, and the engine was running. "Get in the car," Lewis said. They ran. They got in. Eric got the engine started. The truck's headlights were moving now, circling the small loop road of the campsite, positioning itself. He floored the accelerator. The truck followed them out, down the dirt road, past the houses where lights were on in every window. And in front of every house, a figure stood on the porch or in the yard, visible in the headlights for a fraction of a second as they passed, standing, not moving, just watching the car go by. Every house, every single one. "What is this?" Eric said aloud, though he didn't mean to say it out loud. No one answered. The trees broke into the open farm fields, and the truck behind them hit the brakes hard. They heard the scream of it, even over their own engine. When Eric looked in the rearview mirror, the truck had stopped at the tree line. Its headlights retreated backward into the dark of the woods and were swallowed. They drove home without music and without speaking. Eric still keeps in contact with all three of them. They are still his closest friends, but they have never gone back to that road and never will. The thing that bothers him most, even now, is the timing. The truck had been there when they arrived. The man had been watching them set up camp, watching them eat, watching them drink and laugh around the fire for hours, and the people on those porches, watching the car flee, standing in the dark, perfectly still, not moving to help and not moving to stop. He doesn't know what that was. He's decided that's okay. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some roads are better left undriven. You can keep those woods, he says, all to yourselves. The figure under the streetlight. This happened in northern Indiana around 2006. The narrator was 16 at the time. The neighborhood was new, the kind that developers carved out of wooded hillside and sold as something aspirational. Sizable lots, trees still standing between properties, a road that wound all the way down to a small lake where older houses sat separate from the development, watching the new construction with the patience of things that had been there longer and intended to remain. Their cul-de-sac had 3 houses, their own, a neighbor's, and the model home at the corner, the one the development company kept lit and staged. At the end of the street where the model sat, a single street light burned every night. They had 2 dogs, a small terrier named Roxy, fearless, confrontational, the kind of dog that would pick a fight with something 4 times her size without a second of hesitation, and a Shetland sheepdog named Birch, timid and nervous, who barked at her own reflection and treated every gust of wind as a credible threat. Letting the dogs out at night was always a minor anxiety. The backyard had woods. Raccoons moved through regularly. Roxy had a history of charging wildlife and ignoring every command to stop, her small body absolutely electric with offense at the existence of other creatures. To avoid the woods entirely, they had developed a habit of taking the dogs to the front yard instead. The front was just grass and landscaping, open, visible, lit from a distance by that single street light at the cul-de-sac's mouth. From the porch, you could see everything: the loop of the road, the darkened neighbor's house, the model home, illuminated and empty. The first incident happened on an otherwise quiet night. Roxy had her nose to the ground and then suddenly didn't. She went rigid, fixed on something in the tree line across the road, and before there was any time to react, she launched herself across the pavement. There was a sprint, shouting, and eventually, miraculously, she was recovered from the edge of the trees, strutting and indignant, whatever she'd charged, having fled at the sight of her coming, whatever it had been. The following night, they stood out front again, closer to Roxy this time, watching for the first sign that her body language was about to turn electric. Both dogs were sniffing around, doing ordinary dog things. The air was early autumn, cool, wind moving through the trees on all sides with that particular early fall sound, leaves just beginning to let go. Eyes drifted across the cul-de-sac, past the neighbor's dark house, past the model home's facade with its stage-dressed windows, to the streetlight and what was passing through it. The heart did something violent and sudden, not a skip, but a slam, a physical impact from the inside. The legs did not move. The mind could not immediately organize what the eyes were receiving into any category it recognized. There was a figure, pale, naked, or appearing to be, tall, easily over 6 feet, possibly more, moving through the pool of streetlight with a motion that defied simple description. It wasn't walking. The word that kept returning afterward, years later, was lurching, but that implied clumsiness, and there was something about the movement that wasn't clumsy. It was wrong in a different way, fluid where it should have been rigid, arcs where there should have been angles. The arms swung forward in long pendulum sweeps, and the legs followed in great looping strides, like the whole body was made of something denser than bone and muscle, something that moved to different physics. And the face. There wasn't one, or rather, where a face should have been, there was nothing. A smooth, pale blank where features ought to have been, catching the streetlight in a way that skin catches light, but empty. A mask, maybe. It had to have been a mask. But the certainty of that explanation was hard to hold while looking at it. The figure passed through the streetlight and continued down the main road, the steep wooded road that led to the lake. It never turned, never slowed, never seemed aware of being watched. The moment it was past the light and swallowed by the darkness of the main road, the mind returned to the immediate reality. Roxy at the feet, sniffing at the pavement. Birch on the other side. Both were swept up. Roxy first, tucked under one arm, carried to the porch, dropped inside, door shut. Then back for Birch, moving fast, running now, getting inside and pressing the door closed and standing there in the entryway, breathing. Upstairs, the bedroom window overlooked the cul-de-sac. By the time the blinds were parted and a face pressed against the glass, the road was empty, just the street light, just the dark. After that night, the dogs were always taken out the back. The theories: a thrill seeker in a white morph suit, someone performing for the empty night, someone who had spent too much time alone and too little time considering the effect of their hobbies on 16-year-olds with small dogs and active imaginations. But the limbs, the way they moved, the length of them relative to the torso. Fear is an unreliable narrator. Everyone who has ever been terrified in the dark knows that the mind exaggerates, distorts, fills in frightening details where there may have been ordinary ones. Still, the way it moved, that part doesn't change with time. The shadows are never empty, my friends. Sleep well, lock your doors, and listen to the whispers in the dark. Good night.